continuing a series that we started last week called To Change a City. We've been asking the question, what would it look like if God used people like you or a church like us to change the world, beginning with a city? And in order to do that, we've been looking in the Old Testament book of Jonah at a familiar story about a guy that God used to do just that. As we've looked at this story, what we've seen is that oftentimes the call to change a city has a whole lot less to do with the city than it does with the person that God called. Last week, as we started into this book, I told you there's some really clear evidence in the book of Jonah that Jonah never intended his story to be written down just to tell information about an ancient guy who lived 2,700 years ago in a city that no longer exists. Jonah wasn't just hoping to shine the light on Jonah. He was hoping that by telling his story, he could shine the light on us. And that in looking at his story and examining our life, he might set us up to ask a really important question that every single one of us has to ask about our life. And Jonah uses his story to set us up for that question that he won't tell us till the very end of the book. Last week, as we started the story, we saw Jonah was called to a city he didn't want to go to talk to a whole bunch of people he didn't like, and for really good reason. The Ninevites were terrible, wicked people, and there was a really good chance that if they responded negatively to Jonah's message, he was going to find himself skinned alive, and the skin that's removed from his body hanging on the wall of the city of Nineveh. That's the way that the Assyrians dealt with people that they didn't like the message. But we saw that Jonah was less concerned about the people responding negatively to his message than he was about them responding positively to the message. Because see, Jonah knew something about the God that he served. He knew that the God that he served was a loving God, a compassionate God, a forgiving God, and that if God had called Jonah to speak to these people, there was a really good chance if they responded positively that God would have mercy on them. And Jonah hated the people of Nineveh. He didn't think they deserved another chance. And so when God called him to go, Jonah ran. In the complete opposite direction, he ran. And as we looked at our own lives last week, we said, it's the same with us. That God's at work all around us. God's at work in the lives of the people that we come in contact with. He's at work in the life of every single person that you passed on the way in this morning. In the life of every person that you passed on the street. In the life of every person who lives in your house. Every person who works in your office. In the life of every single person who will be in the restaurant where you go to eat lunch after you leave this place today. That God's at work in the lives of people. And that he's called us to respond. To be people who follow him. Isn't that kind of inherent in the definition of being people who follow God, is that when God moves, we move? Or when God goes, we go? And what we saw last week is that we've got a decision to make. When it comes to where God is at work, we can either run towards where God is working, or we can run away. And there's not really middle ground. That we're either running towards where God is at work or away from it. And we've seen that God has called all of us as people who would follow him to be people who consistently live a picture of who he is, in hopes that at some point in our life we might get the chance to make clear a message about who he is. And yet the truth is, a lot of times he allows us to be in situations and circumstances where the picture that we paint and the message that we tell goes in a way that we didn't necessarily expect. That's Jonah's story. I want you to continue to look at it with me if you would. So if you brought a Bible, and I hope you did, turn to the book of Jonah. If you don't have a Bible, grab one of these that looks just like mine. They're spread all in the seats around you, and turn to page 645 with us today. If you brought your Bible, I hope you bookmarked it from where we were last week, because Jonah is a booger to find. So feel free, if you didn't, to just own the table of contents, look it up. Nobody's going to judge you because they're having a hard time finding it too. The book of Jonah is one page, front and back, and yet it's an incredibly great story. And where we left Jonah last week, as we finished up this story, Jonah makes a decision to run from God. And that's just the first of a whole bunch of really terrible decisions that Jonah decides to make. In fact, one of the first ones that he decides to make is look at where Jonah goes. Now, I'm not the most superstitious guy on the planet, but the truth is I played baseball for a whole lot of years, and I'm a college sports nut. So I've got a little bit of that superstitious thing in me, even though I'm not the most superstitious person on the planet. Here's the deal. Even not being the most superstitious person on the planet, if I know I'm running away from where God is and what God's clearly told me to do, and I'm living my life in active, open, total disobedience to Him, the last place that I'm going to run is to the middle of the deep, dark ocean. And yet, for one reason or another, Jonah thinks, that seems like a pretty good place for me. So he runs to the ocean, and pick up the story. Look at how it starts, beginning in verse 4. Jonah's in the middle of the ocean. It says, then the Lord, Yahweh, sent a great wind on the sea. Such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. And all the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. Now, notice something here. When we decide to run from God, it's never just a personal thing, is it? A lot of times we think we're just going to run from God and it's just a thing, it's between me and it's between God. But that's never the case. It's never just a personal issue. It always affects other people, doesn't it? And in this case, it affects these sailors who have a job to do, don't they? I mean, these sailors have a job to get cargo from Joppa to Tarshish. That's the way that they put food on the table. That's their livelihood. That's their job. That's the way that their kids and their families eat. And here they are, all of a sudden, in the middle of an ocean in a great storm, and they begin to take their livelihood and throw it off the boat in order to save their life. Running from God never just affects us. And yet you look at these guys and you think, these got to be seasoned veteran sailors. For a storm to be that bad, for the waves to be that big, this must have been a really incredible storm. And it was. In fact, these seasoned veteran sailors believed that it was a divinely appointed storm. This was a storm that had come from God. The only problem was they couldn't agree on which God. See, these sailors and these people lived at a time and lived in a place where everybody had their own God. Everybody just took some of the same raw religious material that everybody had, and they just took the pieces that they liked and put it together to make the God that fit their needs or their wants or their desires at the time. It was like Build-A-Bear for religious people. And so these people would just take all of their gods and tailor-make a God that fit their needs and their wants and their desires from all of the raw religious material. Does that sound familiar to you? That sounds a lot like the culture we live in, doesn't it? It's called syncretism. And it happens when we as people take various components, the same raw materials of a whole lot of different religion, and just pick and choose the stuff that we want to put into our life and our belief system. Or we take all of the raw material that could form a God somewhere, sometime, and we just pick and choose whatever fits our desires, like Build-A-Bear. And so we say, you know what, I want a God with a whole lot of grace. So let's put a lot of grace into my God. And a lot of love. Ooh, we like love. And some justice, but not a whole lot of justice. Just a little bit of justice and more love, right? We want a lot of that, right? And power. We want a God with power, but not so much power that he gets in the way of stuff. So just a little bit of power we're going to put into our God. And grace and more forgiveness. Forgiveness is a good one. We want that in our God. And some power, but again, not that much because I put a little too much in before. And we build a God, and all of a sudden, poof, the God that we want, that we've tailor-made, pops out. Because we've created a God that fits our life. But what's the problem with that? When we create a God, the God that we've created by definition cannot be the God who created us. And when stuff happens in our life and we all have our own God and it looks different and we're all okay with that, when stuff happens in our world or when stuff happens in our life, nobody can ever know which God is responsible or which God can fix it. That's the situation where Jonah finds himself on a boat with a bunch of Build-A-Bear gods. that everyone's going to, hoping that maybe theirs is the one with the power to fix the problem. Well, everybody's praying for their God except one person. The captain of the ship goes down to the middle of the ship to find that one person who isn't at this point praying for his God. It's a person named Jonah. And guess what Jonah's doing at this point in the story? Jonah's in the middle of the ship while God is at work all around him, fast asleep. You think there's some symbolism there? Look what the story goes on, verse 6. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." The implication is we tried all the others. Yours is the only one left. Come call on him. Maybe he can do something about this. Then the sailors said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who's responsible for this calamity." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who's responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" Think about the questions that they ask him. They say to him, we're going to get to the bottom of this thing. So we just want to know a little more about your story. Jonah, what do you do for a living? What's the answer to that question? Jonah is a prophet of the Most High God. His job description is to provide a clear message of who God is to everyone who is around and will listen. That's what Jonah does. They say, "What country are you from? From whose people are you?" What's the answer to that question? He's from the nation of Israel, the covenant people of God that God picked and put on the planet and said, "I want you in the way that you live your life to provide a clear picture of who I am, right down to the way that you shave, so that when people look at your life, they see who I am." These sailors' questions to Jonah are a stinging rebuke, and they don't even know it. This is a terribly inconvenient time for them to ask Jonah to tell a story, isn't it? When his life, when his behavior, when the picture he paints is completely inconsistent with the message he carries. Look what he says, verse 9. He answered, "I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. They are shocked. "We thought you just worshiped a Build-A-Bear God like the rest of us. We didn't know you worshiped a God with real power and a God with justice. What are you thinking to run from a God like that? What are you doing, Jonah, to put us in a situation like this? What were you thinking?" Because when we looked at your life, when we looked at your actions, we had no idea you served a God with actual power. Jonah shows us something, doesn't he? He shows us something that's as true for him as it is for us. When our picture isn't consistent, our God will not be clear. Isn't that true? When our picture isn't consistent, our God won't be clear. That's what happens to these people. But see, Jonah thinks he's off the clock. He thinks he's on vacation. He's not with religious people now. He's not with his people now. He's not with spiritual people. He's on a boat in the middle of the ocean. He's off duty. And yet you and I know that when it comes to God's call on our life, there's no such thing as off duty. That he's called us to be people who make a picture clear and a message clear every day, every door, and every time. There's no such thing as off duty when it comes to doing what God's called us to do and painting the picture that God's called us to paint. And when our picture is inconsistent, our God will be unclear. Isn't that what happens in Jonah's situation? See, when people in our life find out that we serve the God of the Bible, and when they find out what he's like, they shouldn't be surprised. They shouldn't be shocked. When your family member, and the person who works with you, and the person who lives in your neighborhood, when the person who serves you lunch at the restaurant today finds out about the God that you follow, the God that you serve, it shouldn't be a surprise to them to find out what he's like. When our picture's inconsistent, our God isn't clear. That's what Jonah shows. That's what Jonah shows us. In the process of changing the world and changing a city, if our picture's not consistent, our God won't be clear. Wouldn't we agree that's one of the biggest problems in the church today? Isn't there a whole bunch of us that have the exact same problem as Jonah? We have a life that doesn't line up with the message, not just in the big ways. Those are important. If we say we believe in a God who forgives, but we're vengeful, hateful, unforgiving people, what kind of picture does that paint about the God that we serve and that we truly believe in? And when we say we believe in a God of justice, but we don't care about injustice in our world, and we perpetrate injustice against other people, what kind of picture does that paint about the God that we really believe in? We say we believe in a God of grace, and yet we're the kind of employer who doesn't offer grace to anybody who works for us. We're the kind of parent who doesn't allow ourselves to respond with grace, doesn't even allow grace for ourselves. What kind of picture do we paint of the God that we serve? But it's not just in the big areas, and it's not just in the areas of the things that we do. Sometimes we paint a picture through the things that we don't do. Don't we? If we believe that God cares about a neighbor who lives near us, who lives right next to the place that we sleep every single night, and we choose not to move where he's moving, we don't even know their name or care anything about the person who sleeps in the house right next to us, how are we any different from Jonah? The only difference is he's asleep in a boat. We're asleep in a house. But we're asleep when God's working all around us. Dads, how are your kids ever going to see a clear picture of the God you serve when the only picture they ever see is of your work and your hobbies? How are the people who work next to you ever going to see a picture of the God that you serve if you refuse to engage them on any level other than tasks? When we're asleep in the boat, we're providing a picture of the God that we believe in. And if our God is different from the Build-A-Bear gods all around us, we have to be close enough to those people around us for that picture to be clear so that they can see it. But if we're asleep in the bottom of the boat while God is all around us, we miss a chance to demonstrate a really clear picture of the God that we believe in, even before we get an opportunity to share a clear message. our picture has to be consistently clear. Not just for the sake of the picture, for the sake of the message. When our picture that we live isn't clear and it's not consistent, our God won't be clear. That's Jonah's story. That's what he's living. And meanwhile, the situation isn't getting any better. Look at verse 11. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it's my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Now, I can't necessarily prove this, but it kind of seems like Jonah's response is a little bit of overkill, doesn't it? I mean, it sure seems like, hey, just turn the boat around and head back to Joppa so that I can get on a boat to Nineveh and do what God called me to do would have sufficed as an answer for what they could have done, doesn't it? But you get just a little window here of how much Jonah hated the Ninevites, how much he felt that God was far too good to be trusted, because he says, "I would rather die in the middle of the ocean than go where God called me to go." So he tells the guys, "Toss me into the ocean." But the guys aren't totally sure that he's the reason for the storm. And it doesn't matter what Build-A-Bear God you have, most of them are not okay with you killing innocent people. And so they say that they'll just try to row back. And yet, that doesn't help. And they begin to run out of options. Look at verse 14. So they cry out to the Lord, Yahweh, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Don't hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." They want to make totally sure that just in case Jonah's not the reason for the storm, that Jonah's God knows that this is what he told them to do. So that Jonah's God is on the hook for his death, not these men, because they don't want to mess with killing an innocent guy. So that they're not accountable. Verse 15 and 16. Then they took Jonah and they threw him overboard. And the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord. And they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Man, there's a reminder there for us, isn't there? God can either work through us or he can work around us. God doesn't have to use us in order to make a picture of who he is clear. God is powerful enough to make the picture of who he is and what he's done and what he's capable of crystal clear with or without us. And God in this moment is able to bring these sailors to their knees in worship and sacrifice of him with Jonah outside the boat. So here's the question. If God decides to work in your house, if God decides to work in your neighborhood, God decides to work in your office, God decides to work on your kid's soccer team, when he decides to do it, are you going to be inside the boat or outside the boat? God doesn't need you. He doesn't need your picture to make his name known. But in his grace and in his mercy, he often chooses to use us. So the question for us as people on a mission to change the world through changing a city is this: is God going to work through us or in spite of us? Are we going to be inside the boat or outside? And if God decides to go to work in our world and in our city, why would we not want to be a part of that? Why would we not want a front row seat for the God of the Bible to go to work? Well, look what happens to Jonah. He's outside the boat in the middle of the ocean. Verse 17. Now the Lord provided. That's an important word. The Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, I said this last week, we've all heard this story, haven't we? I mean, most of us as church people, we know what this looked like because we've seen the VeggieTale movies. And even if you're not a church person, you've seen Pinocchio, and that's close, right? So we kind of feel like we know what it looks like inside the stomach of that fish. We feel like we know what this story is all about even before it going. And part of the danger of being so familiar with the story is that we assume we know the point. And don't most of us believe that we know the point of the book of Jonah is follow God, become a missionary, and if you don't, you might get eaten by a fish. But that's not the moral of the story in Jonah. That's not the point of the fish in Jonah. See, a lot of times we make this fish out as if it's some symbol or some sign of God's judgment. This fish is not a sign of God's judgment. This fish is a part of God's grace. The fish is what God provided. It's what God appointed. It's what God arranged to swallow Jonah to prevent Jonah from drowning. God sent a fish as a miraculous evidence of his grace. But can we talk about the fish for just a second? Because this is where I lose some of you, right? When you look at the fish thing and you say, come on now, a fish? Is this really possible? Is that really true? Because if you think about it, we don't have any real stories of people who live inside of fishes. And that whole picture of the cavernous stomach where there's plenty of room for a campfire and Geppetto playing a violin and everything looks good inside that's Pinocchio. That doesn't really happen. That's not natural. And so you wonder, is this story really true? Now, I know that a whole bunch of us have received those email forwards from various people at various times purporting to have stories of people who fell overboard in a boat and got swallowed by a fish and their fellow fishermen cut them out and they were still alive and surprised they lived happily ever after. We've seen those stories. But here's the problem. If you do just a little bit of Googling on those stories and just a little bit of investigating, not a single one of them is verifiable. We don't have a single verifiable account of a person who lived inside of a fish and came out to tell the story. But you know what? That's okay. I mean, is it really going to help you believe the story to know that this kind of thing can happen in natural occurrences? Because the whole point of the story is this is not a natural situation. It's not a natural storm. It's not a natural commission for a prophet. And it's not a natural fish. This is a fish that God provided. It's a fish that God appointed. And we get into a whole lot of trouble when we start to look at things that the Bible sets up as miraculous, which by definition means God stepped outside of what naturally occurs and does something to show who he is and what he's capable of. When we look at those things and say, because I can't see that naturally happening today, God's not capable of doing that then. We go back to our Build-A-Bear God who doesn't have any power. This story sets this up as a miraculous evidence of God's grace in Jonah's life. It doesn't set it up as a comfortable evidence of God's grace in Jonah's life. You see the difference there? Whatever kind of fish this is that God provided for Jonah to swallow Jonah in the middle of the ocean, if it was a whale and a mammal, then it was warm-blooded and it would have been terribly hot inside the stomach of that fish. If it was a fish, cold-blooded in the middle of the Mediterranean Ocean, it would have been unbearably cold for 3 days and 3 nights for Jonah. And whatever kind of animal it is, the acid inside that animal's stomach would have burned Jonah's skin. It would have forced him to keep his eyes tightly shut to keep from going blind. And the stomach of most animals is formed to where it is designed to constrict around the contents of a stomach. Jonah is alive inside the fish. He's safe inside the fish. But he is most definitely not comfortable inside the fish. There's a point there for us. God's grace is not always comfortable. God's grace is not always comfortable. We miss that sometimes, don't we? We think God's grace ought to always be warm and fuzzy. That when God gives us unmerited favor on the front end, it always ought to feel favorable. That when we build our Build-A-Bear God and we put in a whole lot of grace, that it always ought to be warm and cuddly. But God's grace isn't that way. That's not even our experience, is it? I mean, a whole lot of us could point back to stories in our life where there is clear evidence of God's grace working in our life, and we would say those are times that were not comfortable for us, right? The breakup in high school where we thought our world was coming to an end, or the breakup in college where we thought everything was over, and we look back and say, God's grace was with me to save me from a relationship that would not have been healthy. I've got that in my story. You have one of those in your story? Where God's grace was not at all comfortable, but it was God's grace. The time where God allowed illness or sickness to be in your life at a time when it drove you to your knees, and you look back and you realize that those times of intimacy with God and your closeness with your Heavenly Father was so much greater than what you've ever experienced before. And that illness, even in the illness, is evidence of God's grace. Do you have that in your story? I've got that in my story. God's grace is not always comfortable. Those times when God has called you to something that you know is going to be uncomfortable. Some of you, God's calling you to do something uncomfortable right now. And you look back in your story and you realize other times when God called you to go someplace or to do something that was terribly uncomfortable, and yet through that process of extending you grace, He broke open the doors to something you never knew you were capable of. And He took you someplace you never would have gone on your own. That's what He does for Jonah. For 3 days and for 3 nights in the stomach of an uncomfortable fish, God, in His miraculous grace, takes Jonah someplace he never would have gone alone. And in fact, God's going to use that fish as an act of grace, not only in Jonah's life, but in the life of the people that Jonah goes to. More on that next week. Sometimes God allows uncomfortable situations and uncomfortable circumstances to carry us places we would have never gone, but always wanted to go. God's grace isn't always comfortable. Last week, as we closed up the message, I asked you to have a conversation. Invited you to have a conversation with somebody that you know, either a child or spouse, somebody in your community group, or somebody that you trust, and to ask the question, where's God at work in my life? And am I the kind of person that's running towards it or away? Well, this week I want to encourage you to take the next step. If you didn't take that step last week, you blew it off, I want to encourage you to take it. Have a conversation on the way home. Have a conversation as a family today at lunch. Where's God at work? And am I running towards it or am I running away from where God's at work? But this week I want to ask you to take it to the next level. I want to invite you this week, as you go about your life in the various places where God's at work, to look for a place that God's at work and to do a random act of kindness that gives a consistent picture of who He is. It doesn't have to be anything extravagant, but it might be something that's uncomfortable. Something that when you look at it or you think about it or it first comes to your mind, you think, no, I would never do something like that. But to lean in a place where He's at work and to do something random, an act of kindness that gives a picture of who He is and where He's at work. It could be something just as simple as when you're at lunch this week and you've gone to Subway paying for the lunch of the person who's behind you, to provide a consistent picture of the God that you believe in. It could be something as simple as finding the name of the person who cleans your office at work, leaving them a note, telling them thanks for using the gifts that God's given them to bless your life. It doesn't have to be extravagant, just something that you would think, that's a little uncomfortable for me. Maybe it means going to lunch with the guy at work that nobody ever goes to lunch with. Or leaning into the life of the overwhelmed single mom that you see in the carpool lane and volunteering. Tomorrow on my way to drop off my kids, I'll pick up your kids and drop them off as well, even if it's not on your way. To look for a place where God's at work. Maybe it means when it's time to sign up for a group project at school. You don't just look for the person who's going to help your grade be better. You pick the person that nobody else would pick. Not because you're afraid that they'll bring your grade down. You make your decision because you know you could drag their grade up. To do a random act of kindness someplace where God is at work, in hopes that you could provide a consistent picture. And then I want to invite you to report back to the same person you talked to last week. How did it go? What did you see? And I have a hunch that if you're anything like Jonah, and you are, that what you're going to see is God reveal something about who he is through you and something about who he is to you. And who knows? You may even get a chance through a consistent picture to give a clear message. Which only raises a different question, right? What do I say? If I make that picture really consistent and somebody says, "Why are you doing that for me?" I don't really know what to do. Well, come back next week. Because what Jonah is going to give us is a clinic. He's going to get the opportunity, after a clear picture of what God has done in his life, to give a clear message about who the God is that he serves. And he's going to put on a clinic for every single one of us who want to provide a clear message. But this week, just this week only, if you provide a clear, consistent picture of who he is, and somebody asks you to give a clear message and you don't know the answer, this week and this week only, here's what you say. Man, I don't know why I just did what I did. But my pastor promised me he was going to tell me next week. So will you come with me to McKinney Church next week and we'll find out together, okay? This week and this week only, that's your answer, all right? We want 100% participation, okay? This is your homework as you leave today. Clear, consistent picture someplace that God's at work. Everybody in? See, here's our message. We believe in a God who's at work. We believe in a God who's at work in lives. And as you fast forward the story, we believe in a God who's at work in lives to the point that he sent his son to chase after us and to die on a cross to give us everlasting life. And if you've never heard that clear message, I hope the clear picture of a whole bunch of people singing about that this morning was enough to give me the credibility to say to you, you need a Savior. His name is Jesus, and he died for you, he rose from the dead, and he wants to give you everlasting life. Please don't reject the message because you've seen inconsistent pictures. Look at the consistent one you saw this morning, and I want to invite you, if you've never connected with him, to connect with him this morning. We would love to celebrate with you. To celebrate a person who heard the message that God loved you so much, he sent his son to die for you and give you everlasting life so that you can have a connection with him. He wants to extend his grace to you today. Will you take it? And if the answer is yes, there's a place where you can let us know so that we can celebrate with you. You can tell him right where you sit, God, I'll take the gift, and you have it. He promises it to you. The gift of a relationship with him and of everlasting life. You can have it right where you sit. You don't have to do a religious ceremony. You don't have to fill out a piece of paper. You don't have to give anybody your name. Just you and the God of the universe do business together. But we as a church would love to celebrate with you. There's a place on that connection card where you can tell us, I'm connecting with Christ for the first time today. I'm believing the message. Our elders and their wives will be up here after the service. They would love to celebrate with you. They'd love to pray with you. You can run that to the Welcome Center after the service is over. They'd love to celebrate with you or pray with you. And they've got a bag full of resources that can help you understand this extravagant gift that God's given you. That's the message that we want to be clear about. But church, for God to reach a world with that message, for God to reach our city with that message, He's invited us to leave this place living a consistent picture every day, every door, every time. Are you in?